A woman discovers her husband has been lying to her about their fertility problems for 40 years. When Jenna Carter married Gary Lewis, she dreamed of a big white house with a picket fence and half a dozen children trooping in and out. She and Gary bought the house, but somehow the children just didn't arrive. After 3 years, Jenna went to the doctor who recommended a fertility specialist. Jenna and Gary went to the famous doctor, who immediately put them through a lot of tests, and some of them were very embarrassing. A month later, the doctor's secretary called Gary to make a second appointment. "The test results are in," she said, "and Dr. Sage wants to discuss them in person." But Gary insisted on speaking to the doctor on the phone right there and then. And when he hung up the phone, his face was sad, and he had tears in his eyes. A week later, Jenna and Gary sat in front of Dr. Sage and heard the news. "Mr. Lewis," he said, "I'm afraid the tests reveal that you are infertile. Unfortunately, there is nothing we can do for you. Maybe one day, in the future, we hope to be able to help couples like you and your wife become parents, but right now, it's impossible." Gary lowered his head, and Jenna took his hand. "Now look here, Gary Lewis, I married you because I love you, and we are going to have a family one way or another." Jenna was determined that his problem wouldn't send Gary into a depression, so she immediately started the long and painful process that would make them candidates to adopt a baby. 3 years later, Jenna and Gary welcomed little Judith, and 2 years later, they adopted another child, a boy they named Thomas. The family was as happy as could be, although people sometimes commented on the children's looks. Little Judith was a blue-eyed blonde, while both Gary and Jenna were dark of hair and eyes, and little Thomas was mixed race. People would immediately ask, "Are they adopted?" And Jenna and Gary would patiently explain that they were. And Jenna would add that Gary was unable to father children. Jenna confessed to her best friend, "I love Judith and Thomas, but if I thought was to blame for us not having a baby, I would die." Judith and Thomas grew up much too fast, and before they knew it, they were off to college. Gary and Jenna were left alone in that big white house with a picket fence. Jenna sighed. "One of these days, we'll have lots of grandchildren to fill up this old house and romp about in the yard just like I always dreamed." Gary laughed. "Give the kids a little time, my love. You'll get your grandchildren soon enough." "Well, it can't be soon enough for me." Little did Jenna imagine how quickly fate would send her the grandchildren she was longing for. A week later, Jenna was in the garden pruning her roses when a tall, good-looking man in his early 50s walked up to the gate. "Hello," he said. "Is this Mr. Gary Lewis's home?" Jenna stood up and took off her gardening hat. "Yes, it is." "I would like to talk to him if you please," the man said politely. Jenna called out to Gary and he came out. He looked at the man. "Yes, you wanted to speak to me?" The man looked flustered. "I wonder if we could talk alone." Gary shook his head. "No, sir, anything you want to discuss with me you can say in front of my wife." The man looked even more uncomfortable. "Sir, I wonder if you remember Rosalie Garson." "Rosalie?" Gary smiled. "Of course I remember Rosalie. She was my high school sweetheart before I went off into the service 50 years ago. Are you her boy?" "Yes, sir," the man said. "I'm Sam. I'm your son." Gary gasped. He felt as if a giant hand had squeezed all the air out of his lungs. "My son!" Jenna couldn't believe her ears. "Liar! You're lying! My husband is sterile! You're just trying to get money out of him!" But Gary was staring at Sam with tears in his eyes. "My son," he whispered. "But why didn't Rosalie say something?" "Well, sir, you were in Vietnam, and then she met my stepfather," Sam explained. "He adopted me, but when he and my mother passed away, I wanted to find you." Jenna was staring at Gary. "Don't you see he's lying, Gary? He's a con man." Gary shook his head. "No, my love, he isn't. You see, 40 years ago, Dr. Sage told me you couldn't have children. I knew how much that would hurt you, so I told him to say it was my fault." "It was me," whispered Jenna. "I blamed you in my heart, and all the time it was me. I wanted you to be happy, Jenna. I wanted you to have the family you dreamed of. But if you thought it was your fault, you would never have agreed to adopt Judith and Thomas." Tears were running down Jenna's face. "I love you, Gary. I love you so much." She turned to Sam. "I'm so sorry. You are welcome here. I can't take the place of your mother, but if you'll let me, we can be a family." Sam smiled. "Thank you, Jenna. I'll take you up on that. I have 6 kids who desperately need a grandmother to spoil them, and another grandchild on the way. I hope you are up to the task." Jenna and Gary's family grew unexpectedly by 1 son and 6 grandchildren and 3 great-grandchildren. And when Judith and Thomas came home, the house was full indeed, just as Jenna had always dreamed it would be.